Welcome to Integrated Infrastructure, a podcast that brings you the news and views from industry leaders involved in the development, design, construction and management of the many built forms that make up Australia's integrated infrastructure. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people as traditional custodians of the land on which we recorded this podcast. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and future, and recognise the continuing connection and contribution of this land. I would like to extend my respect to any Aboriginal people who are listening to this podcast. My guest today is Tim Williams, City's Advocacy Lead at Grimshaw Architecture Planning. Our last conversation with Tim was fascinating, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this one just as much, if not more. We'll be talking about the shifting role of the city in this post-pandemic era, the enduring issue of procurement in the Australian construction industry, a medium density future in housing, and what really drives the value of infrastructure. If you have any questions or want to discuss any of these topics in more detail, give me a shout. Right, let's get into it. Tim, welcome back to the Integrated Infrastructure Podcast. Fantastic to have you back. You're our first returning guest. And one of the reasons I was so keen to get you back is because last time we spoke, it was January 2021, and there were a critical time during the pandemic and some really interesting things that you were thinking about at the time, that you were writing about at the time around, are we seeing the death of the city, the death of the CBD, dare we say it, the death of the pub, I think was something that, was a big concern for you at the time. Deep concern. And I'd love to get back into that and see where we're at, now. Before we do, though, you're a man of many accomplishments, and it'd be hard for me to introduce you. So if you wouldn't mind reintroducing yourself to the listeners, that would be fantastic.
I do warn you, I have a thing I say about myself, which is some of the things I say about myself are true.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm Tim Williams, and I'm head of cities internationally for Grimshaw, the architect. Previously, I was head of cities for Arup. So for some time in Australia, I've been here 12 years, but again, I was a kind of cities guy in the UK, advising government. So off and on for, 25 years now, I've been thinking about cities all over the place. And the answer to the question is the pub survived and is now flourishing, but cities are still in a strange state. And I don't think people are really talking about it enough. So this is a good opportunity, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. And when we were first were sort of posing the question, it was, I think you just written your article for the Fifth Estate podcast, and the big question was what's happening? Are we going to go back to the city? Are we working from home forever? What does the landscape look like?
It's funny, I think, because we're all so deeply concerned and distracted by the thing itself, and just wanted to get through that. I was kind of concerned that people were not really noticing, people in positions of authority were not really talking about the existential crisis facing the city from what we were seeing. And it wasn't just the temporary issue around lockdowns. It was the long-term impact of what I now realize is decentralised knowledge working, which is home working. And we've not fully recovered from that position, as we will discuss, but essentially in a place like Manhattan today, perhaps 10% of workers are fully back, 100%.
Wow.
It's 49% back on any day. You'll find 49% of the staff back in Manhattan. That's nowhere near the city we had before COVID. So my concern has been reinforced by the fact this seems to be quite long-term trends now that we can talk about, but I think have got locked in.
And in the context of Australia, you were saying at the time that, your biggest concern was that there was still this sort of focus on the mining industry, and WA was going to get us out the sort of financial rut.
It's a really important part of the Australian story. I mean, thanks for reminding me that Australians got used to the idea that there are kind of two sources really of big Australian money that gets its way to the government. One is around the mining sector, which we know about, and the exports of materials like that. But the other one's the urban economy. So for example, the Western Australian mining economy contributes about 9%, a bit less, to Australian GDP. But the square mile is, as it were, of Sydney, the kind of the financial services centre of Sydney, of Australia, therefore, is about 7% too. So if that gets damaged, it's a kind of big question for me about how do we replace that lost GDP? Because nobody's convinced me yet, although we can talk through all this, that home working, although it seems very attractive to many individuals, and I completely get it, it does have a ripple effect on the spillover economic benefits that we were getting from the financial services in Sydney agglomeration. Think about it, thousands of workers rubbing up alongside each other, creating value by bumping into each other and also buying coffee stuff. So basically, I'm not convinced at this point in time, so that we've got through the health effects, if you like, of COVID, but the long-term impact on the performance of our cities is still, I think, understudied, and I don't think there are enough serious discussions about where it's all going.
Yeah, and all of that in the context of, I've been in Australia for 11 years, you've been here for 12, and all the time I've been here, all of the economists, all of the serious economists talk about productivity, and the politicians, it's productivity. Yeah. We need to raise productivity. We're not as productive as we used to be. And yet we're doing things that are counter.
Yeah, we are. But I think it's a really big moment. I think it's a big moment intellectually, economically, in terms of the way that we live. It's a big moment. I think it's an inflection point in human living in cities. I really think it's as big as that. And it's funny, I sometimes worry that I'm capable of being a Welshman, of being slightly emotional about these matters. But, I do think that people need to kind of feel like shaking them and saying, wake up, let's have a conversation about this. So I'll give you, I think what's been happening is this. Think about when we talked in early 21, the model that had been successfully generating city growth over the last 30, 40 years in the West, but everywhere really, had been an agglomeration model, had been a density model, had been about people getting closer and closer to CBDs.
When you say agglomeration, just go into
literally, agglomeration is a kind of economic concept of the more that people get together in high density places of work and living, the more value they create, right? So if you look at cities internationally, the cities that were higher density tended to be higher productivity. And it's an economic theory of like you bump into clever people, you share ideas. It's as simple as that, right? So that model, which had seen, for example, most cities that people watching will be aware, their cities like Melbourne was empty. So the city centre of Melbourne was not a lively place in the 1980s. And the city centre of Cardiff, where I'm from, was not a lively place because one economic model, which had seen lots of factory activity and stuff and port activity in the cities, had gone, and they hadn't yet been replaced by retail and also by office work, right? So that office explosion towards the centre of our cities, wherein we work, in Sydney at this point in time, that centralisation of economic activity had been the model. So here's a number for you. Up until COVID, 40% of all jobs in Australia were going within 5 kilometres of the CBDs of Sydney and Melbourne, right? So basically that model, for good or ill, and there's some downsides to that model, was going one way. COVID comes along and completely interrupts it. And then people start thinking, well, maybe I don't want to go on a bus anymore because I'll meet other people who've got COVID, right? So we've seen an amazing explosion. Nobody's talking about it. If you're wondering why the roads are full of cars, these are people who are still avoiding public transport, right? So public transport is only 65% back in our city. So where do you think people are going? And I always love the delusion that we have about these matters. People, of course, when they were locked down, they discovered there was a cafe 5 minutes away. Fantastic. Were they walking all the time? Well, Google Earth and all that stuff shows us, no, really, people with the car outside their home were making more car journeys because the car is outside their place of work now, right? Which is their home. So for me, I just want to have honest conversations about where it's all going. What is the data telling us about the reality of our cities? And the reality is 50% back in the offices, 65% back in public transport. This is a profoundly different city. Here's the last thing. We can talk about all this again, but I love this last bit. I said the pub was flourishing. This is very interesting. This is completely unexpected, I think, is that essentially cities are beginning to lose their function solely as economic. The city centres are losing their function as solely economic providers, as it were, and becoming cultural and experience providers. So the people are calling it not the CBD, the central business district, but the central experience district, right? So we're finding whereas there's only 65% back on mass transit, there's 110% people back on the streets of Sydney at the weekend because people are bored with sitting on their backside at home and coming into town to have a night out. So we're finding the party city concept, right? is alive and well, which is very interesting. It's not the same as the economic function of the city.
Yeah. Is that a Sydney thing? Because I can understand why people want to come into Sydney. You've got the Opera House, you've got the bridge, you've got some fantastic things. Or is that sort of a global thing?
As far as I'm aware, Leeds does not have an opera house.
Well, that's right, exactly. Yes.
But Leeds has seen 135, 150% return back on the streets, right?
Yeah.
Because people are going out of a good time.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. So I think what we will see, my sort of crystal ball gazing thing is that I don't see anybody really. I mean, we hear now and again governments and companies saying, come back to the office, right? But at the moment where the labor market is very tight, right? So, kind of workers are in control, boom, right? Essentially people are saying, well, thank you, but no thank you. Yeah. So that we're not getting, but there is interesting counter trends. Younger people, I think, want to be back in the office. They know that they can't get training and they can't get sort of experiences without that. Also, it's fun being surrounded by lots of other young people. So I think we are seeing that counter trend. But anyway, all these sort of things I feel are just not quite being discussed enough. It's, we can have discussions about the future of energy and everybody's very articulate and it's full of policies and stuff. The future of our cities.
Yeah.
Why
aren't people talking about it?
I think partly because, this is where I move from, Williams being very objective about these parties to my own views about these things. You've got to filter this out.
Yeah,
right?
So we're here for your opinions.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
But there's I worry that there's a kind of laptop class thing going on, where there's a kind of, the people who can work at home, and I think it's really great for all that kind of stuff, are looking after, and I understand it, they're looking after themselves because that's what, in a sense, that's your primary obligation in life, to look after yourself and your family. The inadvertent side effect of that is to damage the economic GDP and productivity of the city. And I think that sort of dissonance between what's kind of feels good for me and what might be good for society is not being discussed. I think the other thing is people are underestimating this. How do most people get fit in a city? It's not going to the gym, right? It's actually walking to the public transport to go to work, right? How do people get mentally well in this society? Is it just by sitting on your own, looking at the screen? No, I don't think anybody's ever said that. It's about getting out there and meeting people. I still don't really understand why these things are not being properly discussed. I wonder if it's just that they come in the too hard box and people are giving up. Here's another consequence, right? So it was this study done last week, an HR study, showing that on the one hand, women with children think, oh, great, I'm at home, it's easier to run our lives. But they're also beginning to worry about whether they'll be missed or not noticed, and therefore miss out on promotion because they're not in the office, right? So I think all these things are still in play. Yeah. If you ask me, where they land, I don't know, but I want these conversations.
Well, I mean, one of the things that we did talk about, on the last podcast, which is as relevant now, and the idea of not talking about these things, is that it's a really difficult question, because actually what you're talking about is a socio-economic question, and from a social point of view, it's acknowledging that actually we have a whole underclass of people who aren't even in this conversation, because they have to go to the supermarkets and stock the shelves or deliver parcels, or
it's been a huge omission in the conversation.
Yeah.
There's a kind of collective we being assumed that doesn't include at least 40% of the population. I mean, I love the idea that it was great during lockdown because everything got delivered and stuff. Well, who delivered it to you, right? And they weren't capable of working at home, being saved from. So I think there's a really important conversation about the differential social logical impact of the COVID and lockdown experiences and where we go next. I mean, most of the jobs being lost in cities because of this disempowering of the agglomeration effect, this decentralisation thing, are working class jobs, frankly, and people who were not earning very much before in the modern city, but are now having to leave the modern city because they can't afford to be here at all. So I think there's some long-term consequences of this. I know that people focus, and I'm not going to diss this. I mean, obviously, there's some people get some real benefits out of this, and it sounds as though it's funny. As somebody, you will know this, but as somebody, I come from a kind of strong trade union background where I'm for normally workers looking after themselves. I'm just a bit worried that there's a kind of thing going on here where we're not understanding the social consequences of this kind of moment. And I think the other thing is, if I'm pushed and I've had one or two drinks, I might say, I feel as though that we're still going through the kind of PTSD from the lockdown experience. I think we're just not really understanding this. It's not normal. It's not normal to be in your office, as it were, at home all day, not seeing people. That's just not normal, right? Yeah. So anyway, that's where we're at.
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of conversation around the impact that it's had on children in early education and tertiary education.
Not a beneficial effect.
No,
that's what I rush to tell you. Of course, right?
Quite. So the idea that the negative effects of children not being socialised, not having the learning opportunities, not developing, that they would be any different in a work environment, because we're all human. Okay, we're at different stages of our development and life and what have you, but they're exactly the same principles behind that social interaction.
But I think two things: one a negative and one a really interesting thing. The negative is this, right? To reinforce this point. I'm an ex-teacher who ran away from the classroom because kids are scary, right? So I just want to put it out there. But you discover that hundreds of thousands of children are missing from the school rolls in the UK. They never went back. Right. Some of these kids never went back, right? Yeah. And secondly, that it's the laptop class has laptops, right? But the other children didn't. So some of these kids were not getting any education, on Zoom. Yeah. At home, right? This is a catastrophe, a social catastrophe affecting the bottom 10% of the population. And again, no conversations about these matters. I think what's interesting, the bit that's been missed is that none of this would have happened were it not for a trend already in play, which is obviously the decentralizing capacity of technology, right? So I think what I need to sort of put into the context here, some of this stuff was happening and was going to happen. So I think online retail was happening before, but they speeded up about 10 times in 2 years. And I think it's the fact that we're not prepared for it. I think that normally social change doesn't occur at that speed, right? So I think, to be fair, I think that in a sense, the media discussion, the intellectual discussion, the political discussion has taken some time to even realize it's happened. It's like normally these things take decades. So you had a kind of, I could give you a number, right? Amazon trebled its land holdings in 2 years of COVID.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Right? What? That is an astounding fact. And the tech people were adding billions to their assets because of what was going on, right? But the landholding side means that cities are going to change in the way that they perform and are structured around logistics, right? So that's not going back in the bottle, right? So the online retail stuff is not going back in the bottle. It's reshaping our cities dramatically. So you're going to see the reinvention of shopping malls. They're going to become, some of them will just go out of business, and some of them already have gone out of business. So many of them are just going to be repurposed for mixed uses. They're going to become other things. And the clever ones will combine the kind of retail stuff with, some of them will put a creche in, or a school, or a health center. So, this stuff is reverberating still. It's got a long way to go in terms of the redesign. I said industrial land, it became the hottest real estate internationally in any city in the world. Nobody would have said that 2-3 years ago. It superseded residential in terms of its uplift in prices, right? Some of the places in London and some in Sydney went up between 50 and 80%. In 2 years, right? Because that became, investors understood, the modern city is going to be run on that logistics, online delivery, kind of home delivery basis, right? So I'm just kind of, I'm fascinated at one level by this shift in business models. There's a great phrase from the 19th century, and it's funny, I rarely quote Marx, I have to tell you, right? But Marx had a great phrase, which is, he thought capitalism was so revolutionary. He said, all that's solid melts into the air, right? I believe that we've been going through a dissolving moment of business models, of conventional understandings, of received wisdom about how these things work. And we're kind of, I feel that the other metaphor is the guy who goes in, I think like this, the guy goes into the hospital. This is a conventional thing. People used to tell me this, that when a guy goes into hospital to have his leg removed through some injury or something, and apparently they still think they can feel their toes for years afterwards. That, I think, is the modern self-understanding of our cities, is that we think our leg is still there. I don't think it is, but it's taken a while. We still think we can feel our toes.
So people still talking about when it comes back, and you think that we've reached that point. We're as back as we were ever going to be.
The status quo has disappeared. The status quo ante has disappeared.
Is it now.
Yeah, this is it, right? So we build, and the issue then becomes choice. See, we move to the next thing, right? So one is recognizing reality. And we're still under-informed about the data and the trends. I mean, when I said to you 49, 50% back in Manhattan, that's a big fact. I don't think we understand that. In London, 60% maximum.
So that's about 60% here?
But here, and in fact, here's a profound fact for you about Sydney, is that JLL did some research a couple of weeks ago showing that the rents for offices in Sydney were hit more than almost any other city they looked at. And they were trying to work out why, which relates to a second Australian fact. We've all got big homes near the centre of cities that we can go to do our online work at. Yeah. Whereas many cities in the world, people lived in small flats, right? So they had to go back into the office. Whereas we didn't have to go back into the office so much. So I think we don't, number one, understand reality. Number one, understand the trends, right? Let's really have a proper data understanding of what's going on. The second thing I think is choices. We instead of assuming that the model was going one way, right? The exciting, uncertain moment is we have a choice, right? So are we going to try and restore that model of agglomeration of all the kind of office development going towards the CBDs? Or is that not available going forward? So what are the choices? So here's one. And the City of Sydney planning department will be under pressure now to put more residential in the city and less office, right? And they will be opposed to that traditionally because they've always felt it was their role to protect the economic role of the City of Sydney rather than just let it all go to the easiest thing to do, which is residential. On the other hand, if people are not coming into the city so much, residential might help the economic activity of the city centre. What do you think?
I mean, the thing that is most present in my mind is that we are in the whole global economy is overheated right now.
Yeah, for sure.
We're hot. When you talk about people, it's the choices, the decisions, and what have you. People are making decisions in the context of the job market right now. And to your point about women who are concerned about their roles and whether they're getting the profile. And I think I relayed an anecdote to you about somebody that I was talking to the other day who. They have a diverse team who are, got people in South Africa, people in New Zealand, people in India, and people in Sydney. And the people in Sydney were saying, well, why do I have to come to the office? Because the people in India don't have to come to the office.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's the environment we're in, whether people can make those statements and make those decisions. But if the market cools down, people need to be seen. People will want to be seen.
I think that's the greatest unknown, not the greatest unknown, but a key factor in the discussion will be if the job market goes in the opposite direction and people start concerned about their economic future, will they then be, in a sense, quote, more willing to go into CBD? And I think that's likely. Do I think it'll go back to 100%? No, I don't. And I think that, even if it goes, think about it, see, I started calling this 18 months ago. I thought the end game would be the 70% city, right? 70% back in the offices, 70% back on public transport. That's not the city we had before. So I think, and I think the other thing is, and again, this is a discussion, right? This is me. Every time I say something like this, I get 500 people on LinkedIn saying, oh, you're forgetting the positives and all this kind of stuff. Okay. But here's some real thing to think about. Market thinking hasn't gone away. Just because you're at home, market thinking hasn't gone away. If I'm a boss and I'm thinking, well, they all seem to want to work outside the office, so maybe I don't need the office anymore physically, right? They all want to work in Balgowlah or somewhere in Sydney, or maybe they want to work in Coffs Harbour. That's great. Maybe I should pay them less because they don't have so many costs now. And what if I can get the job done in Bangalore, actually? Because I don't need them now. They've told me that I don't need their physical presence. So why do I need online people in Australia? Why can't I get people who speak English perfectly well and understand Australian and British kind of market context very well in India? So I think we're forgetting there's a kind of there's a kind of romance that everything can change except my living standards from this process. Well, why?
Yeah.
So anyway, but look, I mean, your point is a good one, right? Which is it's still in play, right? But remember, people still have to make decisions until we know the answer. So if you're a planning authority and somebody's like a developer says, look, I can't put this office up anymore. Do you mind if I do residential? What do you do? So these decisions have to be made now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about the great housing Ponzi scheme, which I loved that as a banner last time. But before we get onto that, one of the, let's say that our market, our economy continues to hum as it is. We know that we are. I mean, just look at the infrastructure and construction market. We are 200,000 people short of what we need to deliver the current pipeline in 2023. And we haven't got enough visa spaces to bring those people in, and we haven't got enough houses to put them in.
No, it's great. So the thing is, I'm only laughing because it's just this is one of the few honest conversations I think that have been had about these matters, right? So here's an interesting point, right? So inflation has become the problem of the moment everywhere. It's very bad in the UK. It's about 14%, but it's 9 or 10% a year, really. So, we were already quite costly to do infrastructure in. I think again, we need to get out more because anybody who traveled internationally was an infrastructure person used to come back shell shocked at how cheap it was comparatively to do business. Like in Scandinavia, it was like 3 times cheaper or something because, lots of things, labor costs. We're an island, it's a big place. And we've got maybe not enough people in the market to help us compete in terms of delivering big infrastructure, not enough diversity of companies. So anyway, all that was true before. And then, of course, migrants stop coming. So labor costs go up and all that stuff, right? So I think you're right. I think there's dislocation. And is inflation being built in because of that? And I don't know how quickly that gets resolved.
I've no idea. I mean, I think also just playing into the issue with Australia is the procurement methods and the contract structures.
That's absolutely
the
risk.
Right.
It's a crazy world. I mean, I do think this. I mean, by the way, no conversation should pass without denouncing kind of crazy procurement processes, particularly in Australia, right? But I mean, here's a lovely comparison. I always think 60 years ago when they bid for money to the UN, the government bid to actually the UN to help, World Bank actually, to help with the Snowy Mountain, the first phase. It was a 40-page contract for like what was then 50 million, which is probably several billion now, right? It's a 40-page contract, right?
Very short.
The equivalent today would be 1,600 to 2,000 pages, right? Because the governments have gone crazy about trying to think through all the risks when really they should just, say, well, this is what we want. This is how much we've got. Sort of, please be safe. Essentially all that other stuff is added massively to the cost of doing business in this place. And so I agree completely. And I don't know when that gets resolved any day soon. You'd love to think that having been through one of the world's great existential crises where you think about what really matters in life, we're not going to return to a 2,000-page contract for an infrastructure project.
Not when projects like, Snowy Hydro 2 are under pressure and Clough goes bust and all the implications with that, which is.
But I mean, some international companies came into the market here and then went away because they just found it really odd, too litigious and too complex to do business rather than kind of long-term relationships. And, so I do think procurement remains one of the great Australian mysteries.
Yeah. I still want to talk about the housing scheme, but the Ponzi housing scheme. But before we do, look,
it became even more obviously Ponzified during COVID, by the way.
Quite, no, absolutely. We were only talking halfway through the Ponzification.
I called it more right than almost anybody else, I can tell you, right? Because everybody thought the prices were going to collapse, right? But they went up.
Yeah.
How can they go up? Right? When there's no migration to Australia, how can the prices of housing go up? Yeah. And the answer is because it is what it always was, a matter of liquidity and cash. Yeah. And so there was cash pouring into people at home, not spending it in cafes, bars, restaurants. Mm. So where else did they put it? They put it either under the mattress or into a house. Mm. Prices went up 20% during a global crisis of health.
It was 9% when we were speaking.
So, come on, right? Yeah, exactly, because it was on its way, right? But nobody was predicting that. And I've just written a report, which I hope to be published in February, about the housing Ponzi scheme in Australia, which was alive and well during COVID.
Yeah, yeah. And continues.
Yeah. And I think the fundamental thing that needs to be understood is the lesson from COVID is that house prices are driven by finance. And so it's not just about supply, it's about money. So that if there was money flushing around the system to keep it alive, where do you think it ends up? And it ended up in bricks and mortar. And again, it had a differential effect, because if you didn't have didn't have the money to invest in the home, you went even further behind, right? So I think for me, the Ponzi scheme's alive and well. It's still very inexplicable as to why people still think if you built like 5,000 more homes, that in Sydney, the price would magically go down. Why? They never go down. I'm from a building background. When the market sort of goes down a bit, we stop building. I'm sorry, it's kind of it's not like a moral judgment. Yeah. It's a business, right? So I don't think the public sector understands the business of housing in Australia. So the Ponzi scheme's alive and well. Yeah.
And the right now we're short on houses. People are rents are going through the roof, but they're not building new houses because the finance isn't stacking up for the developers now in terms of getting the forward sales.
But the market is unclear to them, right? So what I'm saying to you is that for me, this is not a moral judgment. The market in and of itself in housing has never produced enough homes to meet need. It's just because why would we think it's just like giving the wrong job to people? It's not the private sector's role to pick up people who can't get into privately owned housing or something. It's the state that normally does that. And what we're missing in Australia is it's not that the private sector's not doing its job. It's doing its job, but other people need to help. And that's what I think is missing from the discussion. The public sector, I'll give you a figure from England, but it's the same discussion. Between 1945 and 1975, half the homes built in England came from the council house building and the public building. And when that stopped, the private sector did not increase the number of homes it built in England, right? Because it still has to make sense in appraisal terms that, somebody has to buy it, right? The second thing that's happened, though, is that in Australia, which we don't see so much in England, but is people have 2 and 3 homes. And so I can afford now to outbid you as a first-time buyer and make you a renter. That discussion is not being had in Australia. How do we make sure the first-time buyers can get in? And it isn't just a supply problem. It isn't just a supply problem. They haven't got the money to outbid somebody who's already got 2 homes. So we have a bit of an inequality problem going on. But back to our basic discussion, right? So the fundamentals of certain things changed profoundly in COVID. Other things carried on. The housing market didn't change that much. I mean, who would have predicted we would have carried on building during that crisis? But we did. And we built more. We built more in COVID than the 2 years before COVID. Figure that out when the population stalled. So I don't think we fully understand as a society exactly how the housing market works, because nobody saw that coming. I was talking to the guys who run the UDIA, which is, and they just saw a collapse in house building coming, house building coming during COVID. The opposite happened. Production went up. Go figure. Sydney normally absorbs 90,000 people a year. It went to 0. House building went up. Explain it to me.
And now
the opposite is happening.
So house building went up, supply in theory then increased, and yet rents have now going through the roof.
So we haven't understood the housing market in my view in Australia, and I egomaniacally claim to have a better grasp of it, and it's partly. I think it's because, it's a bigger conversation, but I think partly because public sector bureaucrats have never worked in the private sector house building, so they don't really understand how it works. I'm serious about that. I regret having to say that, but I believe it's true. I've had conversations where I've completely gone away and realizing that some of the bureaucrats I'm talking to have never worked in this sector. So I think we need to really have a proper conversation about housing in this country. Do you think? So do you think that people are up for, I think there's slightly more radicalism about housing than there was 18 months ago. I think people have realized that some of the old models can't be working.
Yeah, in terms of shared ownership.
Yeah, I think we need to try something. I think people are a bit more open than 18 months ago. I think people just are optimistic that the same models, you release planning constraints and it all floods into the market. It's not as simple as that. We need new housing providers in the market. And I think the federal government has moved a bit in that direction.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think not just the federal government, but the state governments as well. There's a lot more action around. So it's interesting when the PPP market kind of dropped out on the infrastructure side of things because governments could borrow the money themselves. They didn't need that private finance. I think a lot of the sort of PPP and investors had to think about, well, where can we put our money?
Yeah.
And so there's actually been an uptick, I think, then, and a drive towards social housing or much more affordable housing, key worker housing. So there are various organisations that have been looking at that. So I think there are the private sector is actually pushing some of those models now, which will be quite different.
I think we're seeing, we know there's going to be a lot more build to rent, and I welcome that. Historically, the problem has been that if you just jack up the amount of money in the housing economy, the prices go up. So just finding new sources of finance has not been a good thing in itself. The issue is about then finding new sources of supply outside the conventional market approach. That's the issue. And I think we're at a point where people are beginning to understand that.
Yeah. But I mean, unless they change the model for raising finance and how a developer would actually be able, they have to have forward sales to actually get the money to actually get the thing out the ground. Which in the current market where people are cautious about, the people who would be buying 1-bed, 2-bed units and what have you. It's very hard for them to get those forward sales.
But I'm not going to be optimistic about that part. So the part optimism, I think the federal government, partly through people I know quite well who understand this, are basically saying, well, there's a bit of a gap sometimes that maybe the public sector needs to help. Sometimes when the private sector can't bear the construction risk because the banks won't lend and all this kind of stuff. So there's a bit of an interesting discussion about whether that can change. Yeah. But it's interesting because there was a 1991 property crisis here. The banks became slightly more cautious here, requiring advanced sales a lot more in Australia than in the UK, by the way. So the system is slightly different here. So look, I think there are certain fundamental constraints in the private sector market, which are finance-driven, access to finance-driven. So maybe that will change. But I still fundamentally believe this, and this is nothing to do with the fact that I grew up in public housing, is that I think that there's a missing piece of the housing jigsaw in Australia, and it's the role of government to do a bit more than we're seeing. And it's not just a planning thing, it's a supply thing. So we'll see how that pans out.
So, thank you. We've talked about where we were, where we are now.
Yeah.
We've maybe been a bit negative Nancy on it, and in terms of some of those things. But I think it's actually just being honest and we're trying to get the facts on the table.
That's
right?
That's thing. Yeah. I take no view in it in a way. I just like to understand what's going on, right? And I'd like to have this conversation about what do you think's going on.
Yeah. What can we get excited about? Well, if we're looking at cities in the future, then if we're going to sort of round off the conversation, what's the exciting future of cities, and what should we look forward to?
Part of the excitement is it's less certain than it was, but part of the opportunity is that it's for leaders to seize the future, right? This is it's not like, we know what's happening, so we just fit in. This is going to call for leadership and imagination, right? Yeah. So I think that's, for me, that, the moment, cometh the hour, cometh the kind of leadership, as it were. So I think there's a bit of that going on, right? So I'm quite interested in that, It's part of the reason I'm doing what I'm doing, which is, come on, guys, we've got to do something a bit different here. And that's really important, right? The second thing I think is that Australia has a certain opportunity, I think, which is, again, partly because we all went through a difficult time. And it's like, by the way, the amusing thing once said by P.G. Woodhouse about a Scotsman, I'm a Welshman, he said, it's seldom difficult to spot the difference between a Scotsman and a ray of sunshine, right? But the Welsh tend to be slightly more optimistic. But the Australian difference, nobody's talking about. So here's a good thing. Here's an interesting thing, which gives me, kind of tells me that Australia is going to be one of those places that people will want to go to after this experience, right? Is that when we had the Spanish flu back in 1918-19, completely missed in the conversation is, guess what happened when it passed? What happened in America. And what happened in America was people with choice moved from Chicago to California, and they moved from New York to Florida, right? Because they correctly understood that the environment down there mitigated the risks to anything that looked like a respiratory disease, right? Australia had an influx of people in the 1920s for the same reason, right? So the same thing is going to happen again. We are going to be, people will recognize, have recognized, we had a pretty extraordinary story of not having so many COVID deaths in Australia. And part of the reason is our environment. Part of the reason is probably that we haven't got a lot of very high density places. We've got medium density places. So I think there's a kind of medium density sunshine future that Australia is going to be quite in the center of going forward. So I think there's an Australian difference that, again, I don't think I'm hearing anybody talk about.
Yeah.
But I'm sure people will make the decisions themselves to come to like Sydney, Melbourne, Perth and all that.
Well, and is that when we get excited then about the second cities, the Parramatta's, the regional hubs that are growing?
Yeah. So I think that's your point. So that's point two. Third. So I think there's an Australian benefit.
Yeah.
I think also that there has been some effect. We've seen particularly in the mega cities, we saw like New York probably lost between 200,000 and 400,000 people. From the city centre of New York, Manhattan. Manhattan lost 200,000 households. So they went somewhere, right? And they tended to go, some of them went to the outer suburbs, lower density places, and some of them left the city, right? So I do think we will see places like second cities. I agree completely. And we see some of it already, the Newcastles of the world, 3 hours north of Sydney, where you can imagine that you could get down with faster rail if they're planning it for in an hour and a half or whatever it would be. And that's kind of a perfect distance to say, well, I'll spend 3 days up in Newcastle, maybe 2 days in Sydney. That I think will be one of the long-term consequences. And as you suggest, there's nothing wrong with that because we need to see these places flourish. These are, I think Newcastle, for example, is one of the best examples of a post-industrial, regenerated city. It's happening. It's by the beach and it's going to be successful, but this will help it, right?
Even places like the Gold Coast have had a big increase in that sort of commercial space, haven't they? People,
But one thing I'd like to see happen is not just let people do this themselves, which is fine. I'm sure they will, but to actually get policy behind the growth of a Newcastle. I mean, I'll give you an example, right? So I was there the other week actually giving a talk about this, but at the moment, the population growth expectations of a Newcastle on the Hunt are just over 1% a year. Well, why aren't they 2%? So I think in a sense, we might need to see better strategic planning, say, we're going to target growth of 2% in Newcastle and the Hunter, whereas in Sydney CBD, it might be only 0.5% going forward because that's realistic, right? So I think there's some challenges ahead, but there's some opportunities. I think the last thing about the opportunity side, a couple of things about the opportunity side. One is just, I hate to say this at one level because I don't want to crow about it, because I come from South Wales, old South Wales, but the sheer wealth of Australian society is people outside don't really understand, but it's already, individuals here are already half as rich again as the average in the UK, right? So we're a wealthier society with an influx of talented people coming with a very fine, climate and stuff going on. So I think Australia will be one of the success stories of the 21st century. I do think that after this moment of pause. But it still requires choices about policies and stuff. I still think it requires, what are we going to do about the future of transport? The future of the city is not car-based, guys. We still have to work through that. I think we have to understand what modern medium density looks like in a world in which people will live in flats, but they've got to be bigger. They'll live in flats and they've got to be bigger, but they want nice parks around them. And also, so it restores the requirement of great city planning around the natural opportunity that I think we will have in Australia. I'm more pessimistic about some of the other places internationally where, some of the older towns and the mega cities, I still think they will be long-term damaged. Are
you confident about our the policy direction and the willingness or even the direction that we're going in at the moment?
I thought you wanted to end on a positive note. So, do you want to look? I think a couple of things about this, right? One is that one of the great achievements in the COVID period is going to sound so paradoxical, but essentially, didn't anybody notice that we involved the public in co-production of a health result, right? So why would we go backwards from that to return to old style community engagement, which means, we don't talk to the community hall until a day before we build the road or something, So I think for me, certain things have to change. And one is about trusting people more in telling them about why we need certain things, why certain infrastructure might be required. Here's our thinking. Here's our evidence. We don't do that. We've been secret squirrel, as we would say, in the governments that kind of protect it because they don't want the community to kick off. Well, I think those days are over. I think we need to trust people more and actually use their brains more about what they think is required to make the city successful. So I think for me, there's some potential to change the conversation again and to involve more people in the conversation about the future of our cities. So for me, this is like, it could be you hear about the Great Reset, which sounds a bit sinister. It's coming from the World Economic Forum, but coming from me.
From that man with the James Bond.
Coming from me, maybe there's a kind of a Great Reset in terms of co-producing our future. I think the other thing is about the private sector. This is a good place to go, right? So the private sector's changed in the last 2 years. Maybe some people have noticed. So the investors have got more important than developers, and the ESG element to investors has got dominant, right? So even though there'll be some fluctuation around inflation and the current economic, the trajectory of travel is for the investors to care about the environmental, social impact of what they do, right? So that, I think, is not going back in the bottle. And I think governments, and anybody who think they can build projects, infrastructure which damage people's health are crazy. Right. So it's not going to happen. I think there's like a warning out there to people that projects are going to be based and appraised now, not just on their narrow economic return, not just on road users, but how will it benefit the health and well-being of communities. Yeah. That is a fundamental shift, in my view, in the infrastructure appraisal, justification and world. And I think not everybody has got their heads around this, right? So that combination of people power plus ESG kind of, post COP26, 27 stuff, the banks are all aligned to invest in that future. So I think I would sort of end by saying things have changed. Yeah. I don't think everybody's worked it out. I think that this conversation is really important to that discussion. And some things are actually profoundly changed, and good that they're profoundly changed. And I think infrastructure designers, providers, financiers need to get their heads around the trends that we've been discussing, because they will have a fundamentally important role in the future. And the last thing is about the money. So governments will not have as much money for the next decade minimum. They will take a view that they have to restrain public spending, in my view, like they're doing in the UK, austerity, right? In that context, interesting ideas from the private sector about how you finance and fund infrastructure from value capture approaches, if you like, diverse sources of funding, cocktails of funding that are really kind of innovative, like we did Crossrail or the Northern Line extension in London. That is going to come uppermost. So I think anybody from private sector, infrastructure and investor background, get your thinking cap on and go and talk to governments about their problems and how they might find innovative sources of finance to meet their needs.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's a positive message, a message of hope and a message of, really interesting things going on. It's positive. So, yeah, Tim, thank you so much. I know how busy you are, and I could talk to you for hours. But thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for asking me. No problem.
Pleasure.